Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today, we will discuss current workforce challenges and equip you with the best practices to help alleviate those challenges at your organization. So joining us today, we have two special guest presenters that I would like to welcome. So first is Christina Rigger, who's the founding partner at the law offices of Christina Rigger. Tina handles litigation and counseling matters related to labor and employment for corporate, entrepreneurial, and startup enterprises. Tina is a regular keynote presenter, both regionally and nationally, on employment law topics and legal ethics, including employee classification, discrimination, and retaliation, and she frequently conducts sexual harassment trainings for organizations of all sizes, including proper protocols and handling of complaints. Tina regularly counsels organizations on how to comply with the barrage of new employment laws, regulations, opinions, and guidance from federal and state agencies, and most recently, all types of COVID-19 issues from mask and vaccine mandates of OSHA and other regulatory bodies. Also joining us is Kate Zione, Vice President of Strategy at the O'Connor Group. So Kate oversees the human capital, talent management, talent acquisition teams at the O'Connor Group, which help create strategic talent initiatives for hundreds of clients throughout the United States and internationally. The O'Connor Group helps their clients attract, retain, and engage the best employee while concurrently building a solid, sustainable HR infrastructure companies need to thrive. You want to just advance to the CPE requirements slide?
Yep.
So we are offering 1.5 CPE credits today in specialized knowledge for those attending the webinar live. There will be 5 polling questions deployed throughout the webinar for you to answer. In order to earn the CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 of the 5 polling questions. Within the next few days, an evaluation form will be sent out to you along with a copy of the slides and a link to the recording of the presentation. Once you complete and send back the evaluation form, we will send you a completed CPE certificate. We must receive the completed evaluation form back in order to give you the credit. In addition, if anybody has any questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you have for Tina and Kate. We did receive some questions ahead of time, so those will be asked during the presentation. But also at the end of the presentation, we will have time for some Q&A to answer any questions that may come in after that. So without further ado, I'm going to now turn it over to Tina and Kate. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's so great to see everyone. We're really excited to chat with you a little bit about, some of the things we've been seeing in the employment market and hopefully answer any questions that you have.
I also want to say good morning. Well, actually, good afternoon, everyone. And I think we have a really action-packed agenda, but we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. The reason for that is because, as you can see, we have an agenda covering a large number of different topics. And so I think it makes more sense to address your questions and concerns on the topic we're discussing. But if you want to wait till the end, we're happy to get to those questions then as well.
Absolutely. All right, so just to kind of go through quickly our agenda, Tina and I really wanted to make sure we were touching on all of the relevant topics that many employers are facing right now. So we're going to touch on a little bit of everything. So we're going to talk about return to work. We're going to talk about the ADA, wage tax, proper classification, COVID, as we continue, the COVID situation is continuously evolving. So it's still a hot topic of conversation. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the Great Resignation.
So what does return to the office look like for you? I see different challenges every day. A lot of it is really based on where you are. If you are in a major city, whether that's Newark or Camden or Philadelphia or Trenton. I'm still seeing a lot of resistance to coming back to the office, particularly if employees have to take mass transportation. But in the suburbs, I do see more and more people returning to the office, although I still do see a hybrid type of situation. What are you seeing, Kate?
Yeah, so a lot of the employers that we're working with right now are definitely adopting the hybrid model where they can. So for us, we're really seeing the major differences between industries. So for example, companies that are in life science or manufacturing where in-person operations, have to take place, those companies have been operational all throughout COVID. So there was a period of time, during the lockdown where people went home for, a couple weeks, but really after that, everyone had returned back to the office. So what we're seeing now is more and more organizations are starting to say, okay, what does this look like long-term? What does returning to the office look like for us? And so the industries that are not requiring any in-person operations, those are really the industries that are starting to decide, okay, do we keep a hybrid model long-term? What does that look like? Do we ask everyone to come back? And I totally agree with what you're saying, Tina. I think in many cases, employees are pushing back on that. So, we're definitely seeing employees, express concerns when returning to the office comes up, especially in the industries where, you can do part of the work from home. So I think we're going to do a polling question. We wanted to kind of just get a pulse from everybody. What industries are you in? Are you a nonprofit, manufacturing, professional services? So if everyone could just, pop in an answer to the polling question, that would be great.
And I think while they're answering that question, I think you're right, Kate, in terms of like manufacturing and things, we do see them back to work. However, I'm still seeing that even in those situations, the offices are still home. Like the people in the office are still home. And that in and of itself is creating some issues. Like, why do I have to come back to work? And the people in the accounting department are still at home. And well, you can't do your job at home. So there is that kind of dichotomy that's happening. But it's interesting, a lot of our people are nonprofit, and so I am seeing a big shift in nonprofit to being virtual, and I think that goes to even the ability to retain and obtain good talent, is that you're able to recruit anywhere around the country if you have a virtual type of position.
Yeah, that's huge. I think a lot of employers don't really think through that. When I remember when the pandemic first started, we were working with a lot of businesses that were saying there's no way that we're going to be able to do work from home. Like we're not going to function in that capacity. And then, obviously everyone had to make some changes. And I think a lot of employers then realized, well, we can work from home. We can be efficient. We can be productive. It might look a little different, but there are some benefits. And one of them, like you said, Tina, is, you have this whole pool of people to recruit from. I mean, there's a lot of other, things to think about when you start to hire in, other states and you're having remote employees. And we'll kind of touch on some of that in the other slides. But there is definitely an advantage from a talent perspective when you're pulling from not just within a geographic region.
Right. And I think, as you're looking at returning to the office, what does that look like? A part of what I'm seeing is many companies are saying, well, this job is going to stay hybrid, or this job is going to stay remote. And we'll talk about in some of our later slides, like what you need to do in terms of long range from an employment law perspective, and I think from an HR perspective, in terms of documentation and things to consider in making positions either virtual or hybrid in the long term. But looking at that exposure policy or that emergency plan, I mean, that's an evolving document that should continue to be reviewed, just like a handbook, to determine whether you're up to date. And the same thing with vaccine policies, just looking at, what is your company's position? And I know we get a lot of questions on, well, can I still mandate vaccines? And the answer is yes, you can still mandate them, even notwithstanding what's happened with the OSHA vaccine mandates. But we did get a question on this that came through in the registration, and that is, what enticements can we make to make employees feel better about returning to the office 1 day a week, and home visits 2 days? And you might all laugh or chuckle at this, but I have to say, feed them and they will come.
Yeah,
And we did talk about that.
that was actually going to be the first thing that I said. I was going to say is, give them lunch. I totally agree. People love to be, have breakfast and lunch and just like those little, the funny thing is those little perks really mean a lot. And I feel like those are the little things that will bring people back in. We have a running joke in our office and that is, we always are trying to feed everybody to get them back into the office. So we'll send out an email being like, hey, we're going to have Taco Tuesday. Do you want to come in? And you'd be surprised how many people actually do decide, okay, I'll go in for Taco Tuesday. So
you wonder if it's just because they're like opening their fridge at lunch going, what am I going to eat today?
Yeah,
somebody
exactly.
made that decision for me.
Make it easy as possible. Totally agree.
But
so,
also
yeah.
consider morale and collaboration and job satisfaction. And the interesting thing is, and we talked about this earlier, is that when you and I first started looking at these slides, and I was talking to an accounting firm, and they said, the morale is low because people want to come back. They want that interaction, at least in like some different types of professions, and that only happens when they're all in the same space. And so as you're looking at hybrid or virtual situations, people are tired of Zoom too, and some people might want to come back.
I totally agree. I mean, and one of the things that we saw is, as some of the offices started to open back up and people started to come back in, there was this major hesitancy to do it. But then once they were there and they were seeing their colleagues again, and they were having these interactions that they haven't had in a long time, there was definitely like, they were like, oh, well, I forgot that I enjoyed all of this so much. And, now I do want to, come into the office a little bit more. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the hybrid model because I feel like the hybrid model really caters to both sides of the spectrum. So, gives people the option to kind of come in as needed, so they can break up, not the Zoom fatigue, but also, gives them the opportunity to work from home if they would like to do that. So I think.
Well, and just making them part of the process. And you and I have been doing these presentations since day one of COVID. And that's always been kind of our mantra, like, ask them what they want,
Yes.
And I think you're going to have more job satisfaction if you really consider and make your employees part of that process.
Yes, 100%. We work with so many employers who are saying, who don't ask those questions. And, I think some employers hesitate to ask what the employee is looking for because sometimes they are afraid that they won't be able to deliver what they're asking. But I think it's all about navigating that conversation in the right way and saying, okay, well, we might not be able to deliver on everything that you need, but we care about what you have to say. And here's some things that we can do. So I think it's really all about how you navigate that conversation. But I totally agree, Tina. I mean, I think asking is the first step.
Yeah, and let's talk more about that hybrid situation in that environment. I think our next slide kind of goes into detail a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do, we have another polling question. What model are you following right now? Are you all back in? Are you hybrid, or are you still fully remote? And then I think we can kind of, while we're waiting for the answers to that, you and I can kind of go through some of these. Oh, look, it's a good.
Okay. Yeah.
38% are all back in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Half are hybrid. I was curious if people are going to stay in that hybrid, and use the question and answers box. I'd like to hear, are people going to stay in that hybrid model? I'm curious to see what people's answers to that question are. So
totally agree. Yeah. Well, some of the things that we like to, kind of touch on in terms of a hybrid environment, just some things to kind of consider if you're looking at that as a potential option. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the deck in terms of the Great Resignation, but and hybrid work environment is definitely one of the top attraction factors for employees right now. And it's also one of the top retention factors. So, again, really making sure that if you can do hybrid, that you're giving that option, and when you can't do hybrid, what are some other perks? What are some other things that you can offer employees that will kind of, attract them to your organization that might not be the hybrid work environment? Tina, have you, is there anything you've seen like, we talked about obviously offering lunch, but what are some other things that, you've seen from employers regarding, attraction factors that would bring them in that if they have to be in person?
So, I think just not only just feeding them, but, doing something that brings people together. I feel like there has not been a whole lot of things that, whether it's a team building exercise or it's just, taking time to let people reconnect. I've seen that. I've also seen employers offering, different types of perks to employees who do return.
Mhm.
It's a tough challenge to get people back, particularly when fear is the reason they're not coming back.
Yeah.
But again, you're not going to know that unless you have that conversation with them.
Yes. And ask. Yeah, I totally agree. I've seen a couple other things too. I've actually seen some employers revamp their office. So like change things up, make it exciting, meaning maybe, order, some new furniture, create sort of like these little collaboration pods in an office, things like that. I think that has been helpful. We've also seen some organizations do standing desks, and again, like when we're talking about like these hybrid work environments, like what are some additional, perks or things that we can offer to employees that will really like entice them to come in. So I really am a huge believer, and I know you are too, Tina, of, enabling employees to do work in the way that best fits their life. And so if you're in an industry that is able to do that, then, again, ask the question, try to find out, what does that mean? What does that look like for your employee base? And there's a concept of work-life harmony versus work-life balance. And I think that's a really interesting concept. So, work-life balance is really what that means is that there's time for work and then there's time, for your life outside of work, and they're kind of separate. And, the concept of work-life harmony is that those two things actually coexist. And we're seeing that more and more, especially as parents have had to, be remote, and, we have kids in the background and we have pets and all these things on the Zoom calls, so there is sort of this like blend now where work and life kind of happen simultaneously. So I think we're going to continue to see that. And I think a hybrid work environment plays to that pretty well.
Well, and just a teaser for another one of our slides, a new lingo word that I heard was bleisure. And so I'm going to ask everyone to use the chat. We'll go back to it, but what is bleisure? If you've heard of it, or you know what it is, or you think you know what it is, put your answer in the chat and we'll go back to that. But I agree with you. I think, Kate, like there's such a switch to go back to the other side on the hybrid, like for people that are working like, I mean, I've always been an early bird, so I get up at the crack of dawn and you'll see me sending emails at 4:30 or 5 in the morning. But some days where, I need to run some errands with my kids or take them somewhere in the middle of the day, and then I'll get back on in the evening. And it's amazing. I could send 4 or 5 emails and I'll get 7 back at 9:30 at night. And I turn to my husband and I say, I'm quite certain I could work all night long and somebody would respond to one of my emails. Like there are people, like it doesn't matter what time of the day it is anymore, you will get responses to your emails. And so it's really interesting how our workload, even post COVID, has become so much less 9 to 5 and so much more of a blending. So I see some answers. Thank you for those of you that are answering. Leisure, business leisure, and have not heard of it. So it is coming, but it's kind of like what Kate was talking about, like the blending of business and leisure, and how people just, they go on a conference and they tack on a couple of days for leisure, or they're on a vacation and they're doing some work in the middle of the day while their child is napping, or whatever the case may be, where there isn't these defined lines between kind of what is business and what is leisure anymore.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is there can be a lot of positives from a working environment standpoint in that blending, but there can also be a lot of burnout factors because like you're saying, there's really no off button. So, people just continue to go. And if you have, like, I'm an early bird too, but if you work with a lot of people that are more, doing a lot of at night after dinner, you might be just inundated constantly. So, I think it's really important that employers, really look into that and, see what they can do to kind of like create the harmony, but also allow for like some boundaries, around
Right.
things that are happening.
Well, and 2 points to that, Kate. One was, I remember many years ago, many years ago, when I first got out of law school, I remember I had a partner that said to me, don't put out of office on your thing, even when you're on vacation, because we want people to think we're always available.
Wow. Yeah.
And so the shift now, I think, is many people, when they really do want to shut off, they do say, I'm on vacation. I have limited access
Yep.
to emails, because they do want that break in time.
Mhm.
So I think that that's been a major shift that people, that I'm seeing at least. But then I was on a call with a client the other day, and like the screaming baby was in the background. So it was, and
Yeah.
usually, 2 years ago, you wouldn't have ever had that.
No,
But,
exactly.
I have
Yeah.
or you see the cats, and everybody talks about the
Mhm.
cats and the dogs and the screen, but I have a lawyer that works for me, and he's a night owl. Like, he works all night long. And so we joke all the time that we have a 24-hour firm, because I'm done with it and I'll send the document to him, and he'll
Yep.
pick it up and keep running all night. And then I'll pick it up at like 5 a.m.
Yep.
So it's really funny. You have to work on people's strengths, and I think you'll get the best product that way.
Yeah, and I feel like there's going to need to be an adjustment in the workforce in terms of, people being able to communicate, boundaries, because I think, there's sort of this, there's sort of this like idea that like we have to work really hard and that's like how you can be successful. And so like this kind of is counterintuitive now, because, if you apply that in this sort of work-life harmony concept, then you're just working 24/7. And that's not really effective either. So, I've seen a couple of things just to share that I've seen, related to this is, the company adopting a particular day where there's no meetings, so that there's at least like some sort of boundary there, or even, limiting meetings, the Zoom meetings, to 45 minutes, so that there's, not like running into meeting after meeting after meeting. But I think it is also about communication and, and leaders allowing employees to really set those boundaries for what works for them.
Right. And Sharice made a great comment in the chat, using delay send on email, so people don't feel like they need to
Yes.
respond. And I think that's a great, like, I remember as a young associate, that was like the thing to do when you wanted to let people see that you were working
Yes.
in the middle of the night. Like,
Right.
oh, let me set this so that it sends at 1 a.m. so people think I'm working. But now,
Yeah.
now I think that I love that idea that, have a delay send so that it goes out Monday morning and not Saturday evening.
Yeah.
So you don't look like the big loser working on Saturday night, which I feel like I do.
Yep.
But it also sends a message like, does somebody need to respond? Like, oh my gosh, I need to respond now because I got this email on Saturday afternoon. And so I think that
Yeah.
that's a great point, is to just send them and just have your emails all go out Monday morning, and then
Yep.
you'll be completely inundated with response.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I totally agree. And I think it's really interesting because I feel like, we need to kind of like, as like leaders within an organization, we really set the tone for that. Right. So, I know I told my team recently that, a few people were doing work on Saturday, and like, there was like things happening in the chat on Saturday. And I actually came back to the team and said, hey, look, like, I appreciate that you're putting extra effort in on the weekend, but like, don't send out the chat messages and the emails and stuff, because then everybody kind of feels like this is sort of what we're supposed to do. And, and it should, you don't want to kind of set that expectation from a leadership perspective. So I think it comes from the leaders of the organization, sort of like how those boundaries are set, in my opinion. So
That's a great point. And I think to that point, and we'll talk about it a little later on in the wage and hour section, but when you're dealing with hourly employees, that's a really great point. So I
yeah,
just kind of wanted to, tickle that for our conversation a little bit later. But
yeah.
we need to go back 2 slides, because we skipped over the ADA slide.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yep.
So I think, we'll probably address this again with the COVID issues, but I kind of wanted to put this slide in there to really raise the issues, to say this has come to the forefront because of COVID, in terms of employers being forced to deal with and address ADA issues where previously they never had to, or didn't have to nearly to the same extent that they do now. And so it's not just for FMLA, but just simply addressing concerns that otherwise might have never been an issue. And so I see lawsuits. I see complaints to the PHRC, which is the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and the equivalent New Jersey Commission. So I see it a lot where people are just upset. They're upset with getting the vaccine. They're upset that an employer is not taking their issue seriously. And so I raise this slide to kind of discuss and talk about these ADA issues as they might have gotten triggered as a result of COVID and might have not previously been an issue, that you have to go through this interactive process.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to discuss these issues with these employees as they raise them, whether it's, an autoimmune deficiency, like a pre-existing issue that you might have never known about before, might have never been an issue. High risk issues, pregnancy issues, and vaccine issues. What are you seeing, Kate?
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing. And I think a lot of employers are really feeling like there's just a lot of ambiguity around the guidance here, especially related to, any ADA issues, particular to, a vaccine exemption. So, what I recommend is, definitely work with a professional in these things, like work with an employment attorney, like Tina, work with, outside resources that you can really like have another entity to kind of like talk through the situation with, and really kind of like look at it from all angles. Because I think, this is definitely, I know a lot of the HR professionals that I work with, really didn't, maybe saw one ADA situation in their entire careers, and now it's become something that's happening all the time. And it is sort of still left on the employer in some ways to kind of make the determination as to what to do. So I highly recommend using an outside resource to kind of bounce that stuff off of. I know that's been really helpful for me in those situations.
And I'd like to hear in the chat if people are confronted with ADA issues, what kind of issues you're seeing. I can tell you that I have an issue right now with it's sitting in one of the state agencies where the employee wasn't called back because the business was closed due to restrictions from the government, from the state, and then when they did open, they had to open on a restricted basis, and so the employee that was like the longer, more senior employee had COVID, so they didn't call them back, and then they called someone else back, and then that employee didn't get called back, and that employee went to the state agency and filed a complaint saying they had COVID. They were disabled because they had COVID, and so the general population is seeing this as COVID as a disability, and it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a disability unless you have there's some more recent development saying, if you have long COVID, that
Mm-hmm.
the ADA is starting to recognize issues like that. There's a limited number of cases that are talking about long COVID being recognized as a disability, but just having COVID is not a disability.
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of a misconception out
Mm-hmm.
there in the industry. But some of the issues, like the underlying issues, like if you have lupus or MS or some of those issues, and you need accommodations because of COVID, that is an issue that an employer needs to address.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's very interesting, and I think employers and employees should both understand like the full scope. I always recommend that employees that really like, do your own research on ADA and really understand that, and what you can and can't do. And, so I totally agree with that. I think it's fascinating actually. And I actually think that, it will continue to evolve and change, like as more cases come up and there's additional case law, and we've seen from the beginning, since March 2020, that things are constantly evolving and changing.
Right. So to the extent that anyone has questions, please put them in the chat regarding the ADA. We're happy to address questions that you might have, but let's move on.
Yeah.
I think the next section that we're going to cover is the Philly wage tax. Now I know a lot of the people on this call are in New Jersey, but to the extent that you have employees in Philadelphia or any locality in New Jersey that collects a specific wage tax, city wage tax, you might be triggered by this as well. And that is, I kind of ran into this issue with some of my clients, and that is I believe in 2020, at least Philadelphia, they kind of gave a reprieve on the Philly wage tax with everyone being home and businesses shut down. But what happened is, with people going hybrid or remaining remote, or certain positions remaining remote, is that if you had an employee that continues to remain remote, and they were always an employee that worked in the office, and you, the employer, took Philadelphia wage tax, you're going to have an issue there. And in some cases, from many accountants that I've spoken to, the employer or the employee has to file a specific form regarding an adjustment on that Philly wage tax. But some employers that I speak to didn't take it out because, like, let's say, for example, Kate was always an employee that worked in the city, and now she's working at her home in Hamilton, New Jersey, or over the border. Who's getting that tax? But I can tell you that if that office is slated, that position is slated as a Philly position in the office, I have no doubt Philadelphia is going to come with their hand down and say, where's my taxes on that issue?
Mm.
And so I think that's an issue that's going to be overlooked, or has been overlooked by some employers, because they just never really thought about it. They just, oh, Kate's working at home now, so we don't need to collect that. But if Kate's position was never changed, job description or whatever other documentation, then I think Philadelphia is going to come knocking for that wage tax.
Yeah, I agree. We actually ran into this with the hybrid environment. I mean, so, we had a couple employees that were kind of doing both, and sort of, didn't really like account for the time that they were working within Philly. And, so we ended up having to kind of go back and then document that. And, but I totally agree. I mean, you have to change the job description, change, what the requirements of that job, and make sure you have, documentation to support that, because I completely agree with you. If Philadelphia had that person on their list for Philly wage tax, they're going to definitely be circling back on it for sure.
Okay, and here's the results of our next poll. Is your company adopting a hybrid work model on an ongoing basis? 37% say yes, 32% say no, and kind of evenly split. 32% say not sure. And so
Yeah.
it is still, and that's consistent with what we're seeing, like
Yes.
that companies just don't know yet. They haven't
Yes.
decided. But there was another question, and we'll go back to this Philly wage tax, but there was another question in the chat about, in the registration about this, Kate. Some companies are rigid on the remote policy, but candidates command it. How can we build awareness to those companies regarding what candidates are demanding?
Yeah. So, I think the awareness is really coming from the Great Resignation. And, I always see a lot of employers that, 6 months ago were still saying, hey, we're not going to do the hybrid environment. Like, everybody's coming back. And, they're really feeling the effects of that. I mean, there's some organizations that we worked with that, had really high turnover, when they decided to bring everybody back. And, and not only that, but the other side of that coin is, bringing people into the organization. So the awareness that, a lot of employers that we work with are starting to develop that awareness, because they're realizing, it's really difficult to bring people in, recruiting right now on our side of things is the tightest it's ever been. It's very, very, very difficult to find good people right now. We have employers that are, increasing compensation by, huge amounts to get people into the, into their organizations. And, I think a lot of employers have to be prepared to do that even more if they're not offering a hybrid work environment. I think there's some exceptions to that, when, like I was saying earlier, if there's industries, manufacturing industries, life science industries, most of the people that are in those fields understand that in-person work is part of that job. But if you're working in more of a professional environment and you're requiring everybody to come in, that is really an outlier. Most of the professional environments are adopting some sort of hybrid environment. So if, I think the employers and the business owners are really going to see it when they start to feel the crunch of not being able to bring people in and having people leave for those reasons.
Well, and I really think, to your point about, adding compensation, and, what I'm seeing is compensation isn't doing it. Like, if, there's time is money, and if you had to tell me that I have to commute an hour and a half into the city every day now, that's 3 hours out of my day. You can compensate me more, but you know what? I value that time more. And
Yeah.
so I think that telling employers and working with employers, and maybe it is seeing is believing, because it's not until they actually experience it and people saying to them, look, you're not going to get these good candidates because you're not considering other options. It's not always necessarily just throwing more money at the situation. That's not what's going to attract the talent
Yeah.
anymore. And we'll talk about some other ways further in the presentation, but I'm seeing that offering these flexible schedules and allowing people to work from home. And we did get another question in the chat, like, does a work from home policy work? I think it does if you do it right. And there's a lot of things to consider, and we do have a slide on that further in the presentation. But it's more than just giving them a certain dollar figure. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. And to answer that question, yeah, I totally agree, Tina. I mean, I do think work from home works. I think it really comes down to leadership and making sure that you're equipping your leaders to be able to, build relationships in a different way, attach accountability factors to, positions in a different way, so I think there's another level of leadership that's required when you have a hybrid or work from home model, but it definitely can work. I'm also seeing that a lot of the younger generations that are now entering the workforce, like the Gen Z, they're very, to your point, Tina, they're very much more motivated by work-life balance and having time, and money is not one of the top factors for that group. So, I think we'll continue to see that. And, but I do think also, compensation in general, there's sort of like a fight for talent right now, which is definitely making organizations have to increase their comp. But I agree. It's not gonna be just that. It's gonna have to be many other things.
Yeah. And I mean, I consistently see, I've done so many severance agreements and so many reviews of non-competes, and I very consistently see, I'm getting more money, but I'm not leaving because of more money. I'm leaving because this is a horrible place to work.
Yes.
And it's miserable, and I don't need to work in a place that's miserable. Life's too short. And so I think, to your point, in addition, I think having policies and procedures in place, documents in place that set up what the work from home policy looks like, not just we work from home type of policy, but also what are the expectations of that employee? What do you expect from them working at home? And setting that all out at the beginning, and really thinking through it as the business owner or the employer, and having all of that in a documented fashion is really what's going to make that work from home policy successful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, like back to our original point early on, we were saying, ask people, I think also like, asking people what they want to see and what they, what motivates them is really important. Every environment's slightly different in that way. So, I think having empathetic leadership and asking those questions is key.
So we did get another question on the Philly wage tax. I know we moved away from it a little bit. So go back up to that other slide. So the next question we got was, if we move from remote to hybrid, do we need to do all Philly wage tax or a percentage? Last year in 2020 tax year, we gave letters confirming that we made their position remote and people received money back. This past year, we started collecting local tax based upon where they worked remotely. So my understanding of that, and I'm not an accountant, I'm sure there are a number of accountants on this call, but my understanding of that is it would be a percentage based on how much time they spend in Philadelphia. I know as an attorney, and Ashley, I will jump to you to get this question, but I can tell you just from a personal experience as an attorney, if I am in the city of Philadelphia, I have to code that work, my billable time, as Philly work. And then that percentage comes out and gets paid to Philly. But Ashley, you have a comment on this?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I was just moving it to
oh, see, I built it all up for you.
Sorry.
But yeah, so that's been my personal experience, is that it would be a percentage, but also, again, it comes down to being able to properly, whether you do it in a job description or a letter, or if your people are billing people where they bill time, what time is spent within the Philadelphia city limits on your client's work, and then the percentage is allocated that way. So it just depending on what type of industry you're in and how you do that. But yeah, and I would definitely document it.
Yes.
And it's go back into that, employee satisfaction. If you're an employer and you're taking out Philly's tax because you always were, that's a huge dissatisfier to that employee who's going to go, hey, wait a second, you've been taking out Philly wage tax at 3%, I think it is, when I only have to pay 1% in my local area. That's a lot of money back to that employee. So think about it that way. That could work for you or against you, depending on how far ahead of this curve you stay.
I totally agree. And the other thing that to mention regarding that is, I think it's really important to not just document in the job description, but also track the time. So, document the days, like if it is a hybrid environment and you're spending some portion of your time in Philadelphia and some portion at home, make sure you're notating and have like a log of that time, even if you're exempt. So you might not track on an hourly basis when you're exempt, but having documentation for that, I think is really important.
I agree. And we have 2 more questions in the chat, but Denise and Karen, we will address both of your questions.
Yes.
Okay. Next, this is just a small little topic that came up last week as we were kind of finalizing these slides. There is a federal act that I should have checked today if it was signed by President Biden, but if it wasn't, it is expected to be signed, that will eliminate arbitration agreements for sexual harassment claims. So to the extent that you have either employment agreements or contracts with certain employees that have in them arbitration agreements for any sexual harassment or sexual assault claims, they will become a thing of the past, because Congress is so wonderfully putting into place these very long titles. The Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act of 2021 is likely to be passed if it hasn't been signed already by the president. So the takeaway for all of you on this call is to evaluate your current agreements and determine whether you have them in there and to what extent they still apply.
Yeah. And also, do everything you can, obviously, to prevent getting, having any kind of, sexual harassment claims, and that piece really comes down to training leaders, making sure that you're having open communication about things, making sure that you have a complaint policy in your handbook so that you can kind of resolve things as they come up. Also making sure that your HR department is equipped to do proper workplace investigations. So, having all of that in place, I think also can hopefully get you to a point where you're not having to, go have a sexual harassment claim. So I think that's really important as well.
All right, so now on to a much bigger topic, the Department of Labor, which I think makes everyone kind of shudder a little bit. But lots going on in the Department of Labor. And I think part of this comes from, we are in an era with a Democratic president, and I only bring this up to say Democratic philosophies are pro-employee. Republican philosophies are pro-employer. So under a Republican president, as some of you may recall under President Trump, all these agencies like the NLRB and the Department of Labor, their budgets were slashed and they shrunk in size. And now under a Democratic presidency that are employee based, these agencies are being well funded like they were under the Obama presidency. And so you're going to see more claims, you're going to see more activity. There was a press release that came out just last week that said the Department of Labor is hiring 100 more investigators to investigate employee claims of misclassification. And, we'll go into that. But so we raise these issues as a caution to all of you to say, make sure, especially under how you're operating now, that you have the right people in place and you're paying them correctly as the right classification, because this agency is and will continue to grow over the next couple of years, and so you will see, your risk of a claim will increase exponentially.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
So the first area that I am seeing this, and I don't know, Kate, if you're kind of getting the same experience at the O'Connor Group, but what we're seeing is there's so many, as businesses kind of come back up, or come back up more slowly. And I know some businesses are crazy busy, but some are not. And so employers and businesses and nonprofits are using kind of independent contractors to fill those gaps because it's cheaper than hiring a full-time employee. So they're saying, well, let's bring this independent contractor on and hire them for a period of time because we don't have to pay them as an employee. And that's just wrong. If you are, if this person is integral to your business, if they fall within either the Fair Labor Standards Act or the IRS 20-factor test, as an employee type of function, you have to hire them as a part-time employee, not as an independent contractor.
Yeah.
But that's what we're seeing. Kate, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, the same thing. I think we actually work with a lot of entrepreneurial businesses, so a lot of smaller companies. And I think a lot of small companies, want to start with independent contractors because it's a little bit less risk and it's a little easier for them to scale and grow. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Tina. I mean, you have to be really careful. One of the things I always say to the companies we work with is if you have them working on a set schedule and if you're training them, those are two of the top two indicators that they should be most likely classified as an employee and not an independent contractor. Independent contractors should really be able to make their own schedule. They should be able to say yes or no to work. And they should be completely independent in terms of how they do their job. So, the two things I always ask, and there's many other factors like you mentioned, Tina, but the two things that I always kind of elevate to the top are, are you having them work a set schedule? And are you training them? And I think those are two things to kind of dig into a little deeper and to really determine if they should be 1099 or if they should be a W-2 employee.
And two of the ones that I see and that have been the sticking point in audits that I've been involved in with the Department of Laborers, are they integral to the business? Are they a key function in your business? Do they perform the same work side by side with another employee that's an employee that's a W-2? That's huge.
That's huge.
But also, are you paying them hourly? That's another big thing, because think about it, that independent contractor, and I always go back to the painter that paints your house. You're not paying them on an hourly basis to paint your house. So they come in, they say, this is how much the job is. I can do it in 2 weeks. And they get half up front and half at the end. Like, that's an independent contractor. If somebody that's coming in and working for you 40 hours a week or 30 hours a week every week, and they're working in your office or they're working remotely and you're giving them projects and they're working by the hour, typically not an independent contractor.
Yeah. Yep, I completely agree. I think that's actually a really great way to kind of do that sort of, test, because that's so spot on, yeah, like, and again, that comes back to, the scheduling piece too. If you're tracking their time and you're, saying, hey, you're working at this time and this is how much you're working, it's most likely they need to be an employee. So yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's really important to just really be careful with this, especially with the changes with the DOL, because I do think there's going to be more audits regarding that. So
yeah, so that's kind of the first piece of the Department of Labor, like, audit situation. And then the second piece on the next slide is these wage and hour audits in terms of how you're paying people, who you're paying. Are they, look at the hourly and salary thresholds. And by that, I mean, like, so many people shuffled their jobs. People are not working or doing what they were doing 2 years ago. And so to the extent that they are no longer doing salary type of work, or to the extent that they are now doing salary type of work, look at what exactly their job functions are and do a reassessment as to whether or not they are properly classified as hourly or salaried. So that's kind of the first thing. And the second thing is, go back to that bleisure, go back to that work-life harmony. When are people working and how are you paying them? If they are hourly, make sure that you are capturing all that time if they're home. And I know that a lot of companies have been doing this now since 2020, but if you're continuing to keep these people at home, what measures do you have in place to properly get at that time that they are working while they are home? even if they come into the office and then they're working at home and it's like they're sitting on their couch at night and they're like, oh, let me check these emails and I'll answer. Well, if they're hourly, they need to be paid for that. And so
Mhm.
how are you capturing that? Because I think that those are going to be huge areas of focus for the Department of Labor in the coming year. What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's really important, there's the two things to really look at for the hourly and salary is really the salary test and then the duties test. So like you were saying, look at the duties, look at the how you're paying them and the compensation. The good news is there's been a lot of technology advancements. There's a lot more systems now that enable remote environments, to function in a more efficient way. And a lot of the systems can actually, you can use those systems to log the time when people are working. So, I think that looking into that is a great way if you are doing a hybrid work environment, because, then it's a little easier than just making sure that people are documenting it, because you might have like a system where you log in and you kind of clock in that way and you can track time that way. So definitely look at that. But yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it definitely makes things a little more complicated when you're kind of doing this sort of like working from home and it's not, people can't sit next to you to see what you're doing. So, that can definitely make things a little bit more complicated.
One of the other things that I always caution with is, in 2020, I saw, and I'm sure you did too, Kate, some really I saw ironing board desks. And I saw some really creative stuff. And,
Yeah.
As people are kind of coming back to work and you're saying, well, these people are still going to work at home, whether they be, medical processors or coders or people that you don't really need to put back in the office. One of the things that you need to look at is the confidentiality of the documents that you're giving them. So if you have an employee that now you're saying, well, you can do medical coding at home, but that person had always worked in your office, like where are they doing that work? Are they doing it on the dining room table where every time somebody walks by, they see all of that medical or confidential information?
Yeah.
So really considering implications that you might have not had to think about if that person was in your office, with confidentiality and other issues that come into play that in 2020 kind of everybody blew past because there was such a dire urgency. But now as you're moving forward in terms of operating this way on an ongoing basis, that you need to consider.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, again, I think it comes down to making sure you're identifying the right technology. I mean, there's, again, you want to make sure that the organization is protected. So, if there's like file sharing, I'm not a tech expert, but you want to make sure you have firewalls and things like that. So, making sure that the things that you put in place for the employees can function both within the office and outside the office. So yeah, completely agree.
And document, going back to your workplace investigations, doing these wage and hour audits and documenting, updating job descriptions, document things that you're changing, whether it be for a Philly wage tax issue or for a job description issue, just revamping and updating how you're currently doing business. And I think that kind of feeds into the next slide that we have in terms of what are the next steps in these areas. Review your policies to reflect your new way of doing business. Like I can't tell you how many handbooks that my office does, but looking at them from a different lens right now, whether that be a DE&I lens, which I do a lot of, or whether that be let's look at how you currently do business. Like, the one handbook that I was looking at the other day, you may chuckle, but it was like a phone chain for severe weather when the office is closed and everybody's remote. Like, so, it's looking at, or a no smoking policy in the office when nobody's there. So, looking at, how does this reflect, are we currently doing business this way?
And I definitely see that too, Tina. I feel like it's really interesting because I think of a lot of employers it was like you were saying in 2020, even 2021, it was such a dire situation and everybody was just moving so fast and just trying to survive. And, so a lot of the employers we work with haven't really looked at those documents until like now, and maybe within the last few months, they're really saying, okay, like, let's look at this, we're doing work in a completely different way, and we need to make sure our policies are reflecting that. So, yeah, I completely agree. And, I also think, like you were saying, defining expectations. I mean, there's a big piece of that, when it comes to the leadership perspective, making sure that employees really understand what's expected of them. And that's also, a really big engagement factor as well. And so it's not just about getting the output from the employee, but when employees feel like they know what's expected of them and that they're delivering on that, then they're engaged in what they're doing, and then you're going to, be able to retain them longer. So there's a huge retention factor to being clear on expectations and communicating that.
But I also think, right along with that is, what is the expectation in terms of, are you going to check your emails in the morning? Like, are you going to check in? Like, is there going to be a morning call? If you're on Zoom, obviously, like, we expect you to be dressed a certain way, but, if you're on Zoom, we expect your camera to be on. We're not going to be driving while we're on Zoom. Like, these are really, really important things that, in fact, I got a question the other day when I was doing a presentation of, is it okay to have a policy that if you have a child at home under the age of 5 and you're a working at home, fully remote type of job, that you as the employer, can you demand that childcare be arranged for that child? And I thought that was a great question, because if they were in the office, they would have to have childcare.
Yeah.
So these are the types of things that, in terms of expectations. And the other key point that I always love to bring up is, with Zoom, is, okay, now I have a fully remote job. That's fantastic. If there's a Zoom call at 3:00 and I need to pick little Johnny up from school and take him to soccer practice, I'm going to take that Zoom call in the car. Okay, so is that okay as the employer? Are you okay with that? And then, if you have no policy on the expectation of that, what happens if you get into an accident? Is that workers' comp?
Yeah.
No. Like, as the employee, I'm going to say, well, you told me I had to be on the Zoom call.
Right. Yeah.
These
I
are
know.
huge issues.
And it comes down to what we were saying before, is like, really, where do those lines, all the lines have become more blurred in terms of, when things should happen, what should happen, and things like that. But I definitely agree, like, one of the most important pieces is defining it, documenting it, and communicating it appropriately.
Well, and it's interesting, Karen, to your point now in the chat, kind of getting to that, I did a presentation last week, and this was kind of one of my number one things in terms of allowing people to work from home, is, as a business, if you have always had people in your office, you need to think about not only lease agreements and renegotiating leases, which I've also done a ton of, and I know that was in a very early slide, giving lease space back or subleasing space because you don't need that much anymore. But also, if you're doing that, or you're redesigning your office, like, those things that you gave to an employee when they were in the office, and I don't just mean like a desk, I mean like Wi-Fi, a phone, printer cartridges. That's a huge dissatisfier to an employee if they have to start outlaying for that, and you, the employer, don't pay for that, are saving that because they're not coming into the office. So, and after I did this presentation, somebody sent me this article, and it was number 1 on the article list of top 10 employee dissatisfiers, is that employees are not being compensated for things like office supplies or printer cartridges or Wi-Fi, or like, now you don't have to pay for phone service for them because they don't have a phone on their desk. So are you paying for their cell service? These are things that, as you're remaining remote, or you're considering these hybrid options, that you might want to consider as, employee satisfiers, retention attractions, hiring attractions, that you're compensating for these things.
Yeah. And we talked about earlier, employers, what are the things that are going to drive an employer to make some of these changes? But saving money is one of the, the biggest factors in a hybrid environment. We did a couple of studies where, employers were saving a ton of money, and they were able to then invest that back into the employees by giving them, we had a couple of employers who had stipends for, an entire like home office setup. We're talking everything from monitors to computers to, the phone, anything. They actually had a set dollar amount, and they could really do whatever they wanted. If they wanted to buy a new desk, things like that. And the employers were still saving money, even with, offering that to employees. But I agree. I mean, I think employees see that. I think, they know that, the employers are saving money in that way. And so, you really need to give that back, allow people to buy the things they need to be successful if that's part of what you're going to do.
Well, and I also think, like a big thing is when you're in an office, everything is ergonomically set up. You have an ergonomic chair, you have an employee. I don't care, unless they have serious medical issues, they are not going to go out and spend $300 on an office chair at home. No way, not happening.
Yep.
But you're going to be the one as the employer who's going to have to pay for whether it be time off or increased health insurance bills, because they don't have the right chair that they would normally have at the office. Like, these are small little things, but if you're deciding between two employers and one offers these things and one doesn't, wow, you're going to go, wow, that employer's really thought through this.
And it all comes down to, what does the employee think when they see the employer saying, not doing that? I mean, it's not even just about the money. It's sort of about, does the employer, do they care about us as employees, and like you were saying earlier, when some of the severance agreements you worked on with, people are leaving. I know we'll talk about the Great Resignation, but people are leaving because they don't feel valued more than anything else. So I think, all these little things add up to a message of, whether or not the employee is feeling valued. So,
or worse yet, it's being offered to the new people coming in and not the existing staff that's there.
Yeah, that's a huge problem, especially, that can cause a lot of issues, not just morale issues and culture issues, but discrimination issues, all of those things. So.
And I think just one more point on that last slide in terms of insurance policies. So I always raise this as an issue, mostly with workers' comp, but just looking at all of your insurance, like if you have general liability insurance and you have somebody picking up papers at my house, like, and they trip, is that covered under your general liability policy for the employer? If I get up from my home office desk and I trip over my computer wire, is that workers' comp? I don't know. What if I trip over the dog who tripped over the computer wire?
Yeah,
like at what point does it become, no, that's not workers' comp versus that is workers' comp? And so just thinking through the insurance policies and whether you, the business, are covered based on the new scenarios that you're looking at or considering with people working at home.
Yep. Completely agree.
So what do we got next, Kate? Policies.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about this. I mean, I think, making sure that you have documented policies for all of these things in the way that you're currently working is so important. So, what's your COVID policy? What's your vaccine policy? Health and safety policies, reimbursements, paid sick leave, vacation, and reporting time off, reporting time. I think all of that is really important. Again, one of the first things that will come up, if you do, have, unfortunately, an employee who, raises a lawsuit against the employer, is what were your policies that, what do you have documented? I mean, that's literally the first thing.
First question I ask.
Yeah, exactly. So, making sure you have this documented, it's so important, and so many organizations that we work with don't take the time to do it. Everyone's very busy, and, a lot of employers think, well, that's never going to happen to me, but get it documented, get it in a handbook. And even the next step to that is make sure it's communicated in a way that's effective.
Right. And I got to tell you, I still to this day, not putting COVID aside, I still, I'll get a call to do a handbook and I'll get a call, oh, we have this complaint, and I'll say, okay, send over your handbook, and I'll get, here it is.
Right, exactly. Yep,
So, a handbook, I always say, is like a living, breathing document, and
it
it should
really is.
change every time you make changes. It should
Yeah.
reflect your current operations.
Yep, absolutely. And just one plug on that too, get again back to technology, get a system where you can quickly and easily make changes to policies and then get that information out to the employees for them to sign off. If you don't have an HRIS system, those systems are great for doing that. It makes the whole process super easy and streamlined. So highly recommend it because the handbook will change, especially now with all of the changes and everything we've been dealing with the pandemic. But even outside of that, the handbook will continuously change. It's definitely a breathing document.
Well, and here's just like a little kind of hot tip. What I know when I do handbooks, I always ask employers, like, do you have a wage withdrawal form? And they look at me like I have three heads. And I say, look, you have people working at home. Do you have a document that says under the federal law, you can only deduct certain things from an employee's paycheck? You have all these employees now working at home. You've given them equipment. Do you have a policy that says if they quit or just stop working or you fire them, that they have to return all of that equipment that you've given them? And if they don't, that you have the right to deduct the value of that from their paycheck, because you can't just do that, and you can't hold their last paycheck
Yes.
until they return it. No, that is illegal. So in terms of, and I know this isn't on our slide, but in terms of considering working at home and keeping people remote, these are things that you as the employer really need to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've had a lot of employers do, they don't think about it until someone leaves and then they're like, okay, we want to hold their check. Like, you can't do that. So completely agree. Get it documented, get policies in place for all of the above.
Especially because, I mean, the more you have people working at home, the more you have laptops and monitors. And like you talked about that stipend, like that's a lot of money that an employer is investing in. And not only that, but and we'll address this in the non-compete, but I had an issue where I just settled a case where the employee left and the employer had contributed a little bit amount of money to the laptop that the employee was using. But when the employee left, he not only did he not know that he signed a non-compete because it was never discussed during the hiring process, which is a whole nother issue in and of itself. But when he left, the employer never discussed it with him, never said, okay, let us get all of our confidential information off of your laptop.
Yeah.
And the laptop, the possession of who had the laptop and what was on it became a huge issue. And so, just protecting that confidential information and, notifying employees like, you're leaving, you have a non-compete, this is our laptop where we have a right to take all of our information off of your laptop. These are things that employers need to think through as they're kind of re-looking at how they're operating moving forward.
Yeah, completely agree. Yep. It's one of the hardest parts, I think, is technology. How do you deal with technology when you have that hybrid work environment?
So I think, kind of, we talked a lot about this, and we'll talk more about like the Great Resignation and things, but what to do now is, definitely update your handbook, update your policies, and incorporate the new way of doing things. But if you are restructuring and you're letting people go, I am recommending, from kind of like a legal perspective, is consider offering them severance. Even if, whether you're letting them go or they're leaving, offering severance as an employer gives you those waivers of those rights to sue. And so, giving a little bit of money might be a huge benefit to having them waive potential claims against you that you might not even know they have.
Yeah, a lot of them
know they're leaving.
Yeah, I think a lot of employers are surprised. They don't realize, when those things do come up, unfortunately, because they do, they don't even, like, it's a surprise. So I agree. I mean, anytime that you are giving any kind of severance, you can ask for the release of claims. And I think just getting that, I mean, is a great way to kind of mitigate some of your risk.
I always say, call it your insurance policy to sleep easy at night.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the other thing we wanted to touch on real quick is just COVID. So I mean, COVID in general, we all know, has been obviously the biggest point of, the biggest topic that we've all been talking about from an employment perspective. A couple things just to mention, it's a constantly evolving situation. It still is, it's been changing and evolving, since the pandemic, since, March 2020. Sometimes I tell people, I'm like, I feel like time froze March 2020. And then, we've kind of been living in this surreal world since then. But yeah, it's been, it's an evolving situation. So how do you stay on top of it? I think it's really, really important that you're paying attention to all the federal guidelines, but that you're also paying attention to state and city guidelines. And so that's one of the most complicated pieces, I think, related to COVID restrictions, is, Philadelphia has their own restrictions, but then, PA has their own, way of handling things. And, you also have to pay attention to DOL and OSHA, and there's so many different pieces to this. So, making sure that you're really, staying on top of that is really important. One of the things that we've done with organizations to make sure that they are staying on top of it is we've actually assigned committees to, really pay attention and elevate any like changing guidelines. So, especially for organizations that have locations in multiple states, if, within HR, it's very difficult to kind of stay on top of that. There's a resource called Expert HR that we use at the O'Connor Group, highly recommend. They actually have all of the, all compliance matters organized and set up so that you can search by state. You can also search by subject matter. So if you are a larger organization and you have operations in many states, consider getting a resource like that. I think that's really, really, really important.
Yeah, and link in with Kate and I. We constantly both of our organizations put out LinkedIn blogs and notations when things are updating and evolving. I know my firm does not kill you with blogs, but we do post when there's an update that affects small businesses and not just huge enterprises, and because that's really who we work a lot with. So we try to put out information that's relevant, that says this is why this is important to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of topics. We're heading to the finish line, but we just want to make sure that we get your questions answered. So if you have questions, if you want to put them in either the Q&A or the chat, Denise, I promise we didn't forget your question. We will get to it. So the Great Resignation, and I just heard on a presentation the other day, some people were calling it the Great Restructuring or the Great, I forget, there was another word, and I was like, oh, I never heard that one before. But I'm seeing a lot of this, Kate, and I'm seeing it from the perspective of negotiating severance agreements, writing severance agreements, but also non-competes. And I've in all my years of practice, I've never looked at so many non-competes as I've looked at in the past year. And I think that is, and the answer to the survey question is, are you experiencing similar? Yeah, more than 50% are saying yes. So I think we've given you some ideas on how to tackle that and considerations to make. And like we said, it's not just salary and compensation, but I've looked at more non-competes in the past 6 months to a year. And I think that's in large part due to the really just tight job market. People that are in them want to know how to get out of them, how they don't violate them, and people that do violate them, employers for the first time ever are taking action and really trying to either enforce them or threaten enforcing them. And that's kind of something new. I really hadn't seen a lot of that prior to this time period.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, I have not, up until recently, I had not seen a lot of employers really, enforce the non-compete agreements. I think it comes down to, a lot of employers are feeling the squeeze of all of this, I mean, it's difficult to retain people. It's difficult to bring people into the organization. There's, financial impacts, to the business related to that. So, I do think I have kind of mixed feelings on a non-compete from an employment perspective. I think they can be difficult to I've seen a lot of more employers try to enforce them, but it can be difficult to enforce them. I definitely agree with getting a confidentiality agreement. That's one piece. Making sure that your information is secure and making sure that people are not going to share proprietary information. And I also have found that that is easier to enforce than the more traditional non-competes, where you're saying you can't work for a company that's in the same industry. So yeah, I'm seeing the same things. I'm definitely seeing it happening more. I think that's because employers are kind of feeling the effects of some of the things that we're seeing.
Well, and I think too, in terms of retaining talent, I think getting non-competes is not a bad idea. I think they just have to be narrowly tailored. I think so many people will go on LegalZoom, or whatever other internet source that they have, and
Yes.
pull one down. And that's not what it's about. I mean, I think the whole point in having a good non-compete is having something that you can say, what am I trying to protect? What
Yes.
is the business concern here? And then crafting that non-compete to do that. And, the benefit of having them even in a tight market where you're hiring is that I think most people will at least stop and think twice and say, hey, I have a non-compete. How do I make sure I don't violate this? Not necessarily trying to litigate or break them, but just, how do I make sure that I stay within the bounds of this agreement that I made when I got hired? And so, in an area where there's a tight job market, it's not a bad thing to have them, but just making sure that they're properly crafted and narrowly tailored is really the key.
I completely agree. I've seen so many non-competes that are so wide in their language that, again, that makes it much more difficult to reinforce. So I completely agree with that. Really like working with an attorney and making sure that you're saying, okay, this is my concern. This is what I'm trying to protect the organization from, and letting them walk through like some of the things that surround that. There's so many factors that can be put into a non-compete. So I do think there's, some business decisions that need to be made there in terms of how you craft them.
Yeah, I agree. And also just like anything else in terms of the severance, like if you have people that are resigning, think about why they're resigning, and it might be something where you might want to offer a severance because then they can't come back and sue you if they waive those claims. And so, and it could be as basic as, we don't pay all of our people for vacation time. It's not earned or accrued. And so, you have 2 weeks of vacation time, we'll pay you as a severance, and, here, sign this document. And so those are things to really think about, but also, I mean, not necessarily, again, as you go back and look at, narrow tailoring, are you trying to protect against a non-compete? Like, is this individual standing in front of you truly going to go out and compete with you? Or do you just want to prevent them from poaching your customers? Because that's not a non-compete, that's a non-solicit. And if that's all you need, then that's a different agreement. And so again, really considering what the interest is that you're trying to protect and who this individual is going to make for a better agreement in the long run.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think a lot of employers don't understand the difference between a non-compete, non-solicit, and then a confidentiality. I mean, they're all different kind of components. A lot of times they're all inclusive into one document. But Tina, you were mentioning that, you had something happen recently where the employee did not realize they had a non-compete agreement. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
So when the employee started their job, they got that. They never was it discussed in the negotiation or the offer. And then when they got the job, they showed up the first day and they signed, the big stack of new hire paperwork that you give them, complete with the handbook and the W-9, the I-9, and everything else that you kind of exchange that first day. And in that set of documents was a non-compete, and the employee quickly signed everything, didn't read it because it was never discussed. And, to his fault, maybe because he didn't read it or he didn't remember thinking it was an issue, and signed it, and then didn't really enjoy working for this employer and left, found another opportunity and started working there. And he was a salesperson, and the non-compete was so broad, and it was 2 years. So I think in court, like if it would have ever gotten that far in court, that non-compete would have never held up. But here's the reality: who's going to go to court and fight this? Unless that person's making $1 million for you, you're not going to fight this in court, because first of all, there's so many COVID delays. It's going to take 2 years to get into court.
Yeah.
And then the cost to do that. I mean, just the cost to negotiate this. I mean, the employer and the attorney for the employer that he left wanted him fired from his new job. They literally wanted him to be unemployed. And we ended up negotiating a severance kind of agreement, a separation agreement for him that settled the claims. But it was not before he spent a good amount of money on attorney's fees, and so did the new employer, and so did the old employer. And I think that it could have been avoided had there been, number one, communication and upfront about the fact that they had wanted him to sign a non-compete, but also when he left, they never raised it when he left. They never, usually what I recommend when employers say they're letting somebody go and they have a non-compete, I say, give them a copy.
Yes.
And if you know where they're going, send a copy there. Full disclosure, like there's no secret about this. And so, the more you can be upfront about it from the old employer's perspective, I think the better.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I see a lot of employers who do the exact same thing. They don't make it part of like the offer process. They just make it part of the new hire paperwork. And that's also a little risky because, if you haven't really negotiated that with someone and then you're putting it as part of their new hire paperwork, so there's also a chance you might lose that person.
Right.
That person might decide, hey, I don't want to come work here. I didn't realize this was part of the deal.
Right.
So, you don't want to kind of get into that situation either. So, so that's really interesting. And I completely agree. If someone leaves, providing them a copy of it, just that in itself can prevent so many situations from happening.
He didn't even know he had one. So when he left and started like selling for the new company, he was like, what are you talking about? Like, it was kind of crazy.
Yeah. I see that a lot. Like I see a lot of employers, kind of just, it's sort of part of what they do and it's not really talked about. And then to your point, it's not a secret, it's definitely something that you should be kind of, bringing to the surface. The other thing I just wanted to say about the Great Resignation is, it's really, really, really important. I touched on it a little bit earlier to, lead with empathy. In what I've seen with a lot of the employees that are leaving organizations is, there's that age old saying, that you leave because of a boss and not because of a job. And, so I do feel like that sort of people component, that empathetic leadership, all those things have such a big impact and can be such a detriment when you don't have them, within your organization. So, again, it starts with asking those questions. I think it also, comes down to equipping your leaders and, really making sure that people are, just know how to kind of have that sort of empathetic leadership and show employees that they care about what they're doing. They value their contributions. One of the things I always tell new leaders is, it's, again, these are the small things that really make a big impact is, when you're giving, accolades, like if you're saying great job, be really specific on what you're saying great job for. There's so many leaders who are saying great job and then, not saying why and, not giving that sort of specific feedback. Like I really liked, your presentation today. I really liked when you said XYZ, like going through that has such an impact. And so again, I just wanted to kind of say, don't forget to be, to have that empathetic side of leadership. I think those are the things that are going to really keep people within an organization. You can have all the perks in the world, but if you don't have some of those, basic people components, you're going to still lose people.
Hey, Kate, flip to the next slide because I think you covered most of that, but I completely agree with you. Like just having that empathy and just, training your leaders, but also providing a culture and an environment that's inclusive and makes everyone feel like they are part of the team. And in terms of retaining or attracting talent, looking for the best candidate, regardless of checking a box, or I have to hire somebody that's diverse, but just really looking for the best candidate that's going to fit the best job. And in terms of compensation, yes, compensation in dollars home is a great thing, but if I get 3 hours back in my day because I don't have to commute to the city, that's huge. And I might choose to work half that time that I would lose if I was commuting back and forth to Philadelphia every day. But also things like tuition reimbursement or class reimbursement. How many people are going to take you up on that? Probably not that many, but you know what? If you have it on that list of perks, like you do tuition reimbursement, people are going to say, hey, wow, this is a great benefit. Look at all these benefits that I'm getting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have so many people that we have a education reimbursement, and we tell so many people, and so many people are like, oh, that's so great. And they, I think it's a big piece for them. And then, but the funny thing is we don't have a lot of people that use it. So we have to kind of remind people that it's out there. One of the things that's on this slide as well is, an employer value proposition. I highly recommend doing some research on that. So there's some really great materials out there, regarding an employer value proposition. And basically what that is, what are the things that you can offer to employees? Like what's your, a lot of times we talk about total rewards, and total rewards is really specific to, the perks and the benefits and things like that. But there's other components, like what's your story as an organization? Like what are the things that really drive people to want to work for you? And so, getting clear on that, I think, is really important. And then, equipping anyone who's talking about your organization or recruiting people for your organization, making sure they understand what that is as well. So it's funny. There's a lot of employees who don't know the full benefits and perks of an employer. They're working somewhere and they don't even know all the things that are offered to them. So it doesn't just end when someone starts working at an organization. Like, make sure you're continuing to tell that story, throughout an employee's life cycle. So so I mean, a lot of really good materials, a lot of really good articles regarding employer value proposition.
So I mean, we're coming right up against the 2:30 mark, but, I think we try to answer the questions kind of as we went along. We have a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions, I think on the next slide, Kate, there's just questions and our contact information if anybody, wants to reach out to us directly, but we're happy to answer any other questions that there are on any of the topics that we covered.
Yeah. And,
I have something that came up. So as employers are considering returning to work, what are some of the things that they can do to make their employees feel safe about coming back in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've seen a lot of different things. I mean, I think getting a really clear policy in place, like a really clear return to work policy around what do people do when they're in person. We've seen obviously wearing masks. We've seen setting up desks, where they're socially distant. When the pandemic was like at its peak, we saw really even more complex things like that, like workflow, people
arrows on the floor,
and that, and you still see that, at some of the like retail, at grocery stores and things like that, you still see those types of things. So, but I also think, and we've said this several times, but having really open line of communication so that if people do feel unsafe, that you're asking, well, talk to me about that. What specifically, because you might have all of these things in place, but then, you might miss something, and then an employee will be able to bring that to your attention.
And 2 other points. 1, make your employees part of the process. Maybe do a polling question to all of them, like, hey, what is your biggest concern about returning back to the office? Because then you'll know. And number 2, communicate, get that policy out to them, make sure that they all understand, make sure that they know where to go if they have questions or concerns, like who's the target person to address issues to. If they're not feeling well, who do they have to call? If they think it's COVID, who do they have to call? Everybody's concerned about confidentiality. They don't want to be treated like the leper if they think they might have COVID. So these are all things that should be considered and part of that policy, but then having it go out to everyone and make sure everyone gets it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I think we're cutting it close on wrap up time here. Tina and Kate, I just wanted to to thank both of you. I thought that this webinar was very insightful. I know in talking to Tina previously, there were some things that you touched upon that I thought were really important to make sure that I get the message out. But even in today's webinar, there were other things that I picked up on that I haven't even thought about. So very informative and insightful. I really appreciate both of you taking the time to present. And I just wanted to thank everybody for attending today, and contact information for Tina and Kate are on the slide here. And as I said before, we will have a follow-up with a evaluation form and a copy of today's presentation and recording.
And I know from Kate and myself, we want to say thank you to Mercadien for having us. Kate and I always enjoy presenting together. And, we hope that everyone that was on the call or gets a video of the call took some tidbits away that can help them in their everyday business.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone.